When millionaire Vincent Harrington forced his maid to play piano at his elite party to humiliate her, he expected laughter. Instead, her extraordinary talent silenced the room and changed everything. The crystal chandelier cast rainbow fragments across the marble floor of the Harrington Mansion's grand ballroom, each prism of light dancing in harmony with the gentle evening breeze that flowed through the French doors, leading to the perfectly manicured gardens. It was the kind of opulent setting that appeared in architectural magazines and society pages, where every detail had been carefully curated to demonstrate wealth, taste, and social superiority. The room itself was a testament to generations of accumulated fortune. Hand-painted ceiling frescoes depicting classical scenes, Persian rugs worth more than most people's homes, and furniture that had been crafted by European masters centuries ago. The mansion had been in the Harrington family for 4 generations, each successive owner adding layers of luxury and refinement that reflected their growing wealth and social ambitions. Vincent's great-grandfather had built the original structure as a testament to his success in the railroad industry, but it was Vincent's grandfather who had transformed it into the architectural masterpiece it had become. The ballroom alone had cost more to construct than most people would see in several lifetimes, with its hand-carved moldings, imported marble columns, and acoustics that had been specifically designed to showcase musical performances. Tonight, the ballroom hosted Vincent Harrington's annual charity gala, an event that served as much to display his philanthropic generosity as it did to reinforce his position at the apex of the city's social hierarchy. The guest list read, like a directory of the most powerful and influential people in the region. Politicians whose campaigns Harrington had funded, business leaders whose companies he had invested in, and socialites whose approval he had systematically cultivated over decades of strategic relationship building. The evening represented the culmination of months of planning by a team of event coordinators who specialized in creating experiences that would impress even the most jaded members of high society. Every element had been considered and perfected, from the arrangement of flower displays that filled the room with subtle fragrance to the precise timing of the serving staff who moved through the crowd with choreographed precision. Isabella Martinez moved through this glittering world like a shadow, invisible to the guests who sipped champagne that cost more per bottle than she earned in a month. At 26, she had worked as a domestic employee in wealthy households for 8 years, ever since her father's construction accident had left her family struggling to cover medical bills and basic living expenses. The work was demanding and often demeaning, but it provided steady income and allowed her to send money home to support her younger siblings' education. Isabella's own educational journey had been cut short by family financial crisis, but she had always been an exceptional student, with dreams that extended far beyond domestic service. In high school, she had excelled in literature, mathematics, and especially music, where her natural talent had earned recognition from teachers who saw potential for college scholarships and professional development. But when her father's injury made him unable to work, Isabella had made the difficult decision to forego higher education and enter the workforce immediately to help support her family. The transition from promising student to domestic worker had been emotionally devastating. Isabella had spent months grieving not just for her lost opportunities, but for the person she might have become if circumstances had been different. She had learned to navigate the complex emotions of working in environments that represented everything she had been denied: luxury, leisure, and the freedom to pursue personal interests without constant financial pressure. Isabella's uniform was identical to those worn by the dozen other staff members who circulated through the party. A simple black dress with white trim, sensible shoes, and a small white apron that marked her as service personnel rather than guest. The uniform was designed to make her blend into the background, to render her functionally invisible while she performed the countless small tasks that made events like this appear effortlessly elegant. But invisibility was a double-edged gift. While it protected Isabella from unwanted attention, it also meant that the wealthy guests felt free to speak about her and the other staff members as if they weren't human beings with feelings, dreams, and dignity. She had learned to maintain a neutral expression while overhearing conversations that ranged from casually dismissive to openly contemptuous, discussions that treated domestic workers as interchangeable components of the machinery that kept their privileged lives running smoothly. The other staff members who worked alongside Isabella that evening were women and men whose stories shared common themes of economic necessity overriding personal ambition. Maria Santos, the head housekeeper, had been working for wealthy families for 20 years, sending money home to support her aging parents and her own children's education. Carlos Rodriguez, who managed the mansion's grounds, was a trained botanist who had been unable to find work in his field and had accepted landscaping positions to support his family while hoping for better opportunities. Each of them had learned to navigate the unspoken rules that governed interactions between wealthy employers and domestic workers, the necessity of anticipating needs before they were expressed, the importance of remaining invisible during family conflicts, and the skill of providing personal service while maintaining emotional distance from the people whose intimate lives they observed daily. Vincent Harrington himself was a perfect representative of the attitude that treated domestic workers as slightly more sophisticated furniture. At 62, he had inherited substantial wealth and multiplied it through a combination of shrewd investments and ruthless business practices that prioritized profit over principle. He was the kind of man who measured his worth by his ability to control and diminish others, who found entertainment in asserting his superiority over people who couldn't fight back without risking their livelihoods. Vincent's personal history had shaped him into someone who equated wealth with moral superiority and poverty with character deficiency. He had never experienced financial insecurity or social rejection, never had to choose between personal dreams and family obligations, never faced discrimination based on circumstances beyond his control. His worldview was built on the assumption that successful people deserved their advantages, while unsuccessful people were responsible for their limitations. This perspective colored every interaction Vincent had with the people who worked for him. He viewed their deference as confirmation of his superiority rather than recognition of their economic vulnerability. He interpreted their professional competence as natural servitude rather than skilled labor deserving of respect and fair compensation. Most dangerously, he saw their dreams and aspirations as presumptuous overreaching that needed to be corrected through humiliation and reminder of their proper place in society. Isabella had been working in the Harrington household for 6 months, long enough to understand the dynamics that governed daily life in the mansion. Vincent's wife, Eleanor, was a woman who had traded her own identity for social status, becoming a carefully polished accessory to her husband's success. Their adult children visited rarely and spoke to their parents with the kind of strained politeness that suggested years of accumulated resentment and unresolved conflicts. Eleanor herself was a complicated figure in Isabella's daily experience. Unlike her husband, she occasionally showed flashes of genuine humanity toward the household staff, remembering their names and asking about their families in ways that suggested authentic interest rather than performative kindness. But she had also learned to navigate her marriage by avoiding confrontations with Vincent, which meant that her sympathy for the staff rarely translated into meaningful protection from his casual cruelties. The Harrington children, Robert, age 34, and Catherine, age 31, represented the logical outcome of their upbringing in an environment where wealth substituted for character development. Both had attended elite universities and held prestigious but largely meaningless positions in companies their father controlled. Neither had developed meaningful relationships with anyone outside their social class, and both treated the household staff with the same unconscious dismissiveness they had observed in their parents throughout their lives. The household staff existed in a parallel universe within the mansion, maintaining the illusion of effortless luxury while remaining carefully invisible to the family and their guests. Isabella had learned the rhythms of this hidden world, which hallways to use when the family was present, how to anticipate needs before they were expressed, and most importantly, how to endure daily humiliations with grace and dignity intact. The mansion's layout reflected the social hierarchies it housed. The family's living spaces were concentrated on the upper floors and the main level's public areas, while the staff quarters, kitchen, and service areas were located in the basement and the building's less prominent sections. Isabella and the other workers moved through the mansion using back staircases and service corridors that allowed them to perform their duties without disturbing the family's activities or reminding them of the labor required to maintain their lifestyle. Isabella's own living quarters consisted of a small room in the mansion's basement level, furnished with basic necessities but lacking any of the decorative touches that might make it feel like a home rather than temporary accommodation. The room had a single window that provided limited natural light and a view of the mansion's delivery area, where trucks arrived daily with supplies needed to maintain the household's operations. But it was in the mansion's music room that Isabella found refuge from the constraints and humiliations of her position. The room was located on the mansion's second floor, in a section that the family rarely used during the day. It contained Vincent's prized possession, a concert grand Steinway piano worth more than Isabella would earn in several lifetimes of domestic work. Isabella had discovered the music room during her first week of employment, while conducting the detailed cleaning required to familiarize herself with every area of the mansion. The moment she saw the piano, she felt a connection that transcended her circumstances and reminded her of the person she had been before economic necessity had redirected her life. As a child, Isabella had shown exceptional musical talent that her grandmother had recognized and nurtured despite the family's limited financial resources. Her grandmother, Elena Martinez, had been a music teacher before immigration, and economic pressures forced her into factory work. But she had maintained her piano skills and passed them on to Isabella with the kind of patient, loving instruction that created not just technical competence, but deep musical understanding. Elena had sacrificed enormously to provide Isabella with piano lessons, working extra shifts and saving every possible penny to pay for instruction that might open doors to a better future. She had purchased an old upright piano for their cramped apartment, creating a space where Isabella could practice despite the noise complaints from neighbors and the challenges of maintaining an instrument in less than ideal conditions. Under Elena's guidance, Isabella had developed not just technical skills, but a profound emotional connection to music that sustained her through the disappointments and difficulties of growing up in poverty. The piano became her refuge, the place where she could express feelings that had no outlet in her daily life, where she could experience beauty and transcendence that existed independently of her economic circumstances. When family financial crisis had forced Isabella to abandon her educational plans and enter domestic work, she had assumed that her musical development was permanently ended. The families she worked for weren't interested in their employees' personal interests, and she lacked both time and access to instruments that would allow her to maintain her skills. But the discovery of Vincent's piano had reawakened possibilities Isabella thought she had lost forever. During her brief breaks from household duties, when she was certain the family was elsewhere in the mansion, she would slip into the music room and allow herself to remember who she had been before circumstances reduced her to an anonymous service provider. These stolen moments at the piano became the most meaningful part of Isabella's week. She would play pieces she had learned years earlier, feeling her technical skills gradually return despite the long period of inactivity. More importantly, she would lose herself in the emotional expression that music provided, temporarily escaping the constraints of her position and reconnecting with the dreams that had sustained her through childhood and adolescence. Isabella was careful to limit these sessions to times when she was confident the family was absent from the house or occupied with activities that would prevent them from hearing the piano. She understood that using the instrument without permission was a serious breach of household rules, but the musical expression had become necessary for her emotional survival in an environment that systematically denied her dignity and individuality. But tonight felt different. Isabella had noticed a particular edge in Vincent's behavior, a restless energy that suggested he was planning something beyond his usual displays of casual cruelty. He had been drinking more than usual during the cocktail hour, and his comments to the staff had carried an additional layer of malice that made everyone nervous. The evening's program had proceeded according to plan through dinner and the charity auction that was the event's ostensible purpose. Harrington had delivered his annual speech about the importance of giving back to the community, drawing applause from guests who contributed generously to causes that would enhance their own social standing, while providing minimal actual benefit to those in need. The charity being honored that evening was the Metropolitan Arts Foundation, an organization that provided funding for cultural programs in public schools. The irony wasn't lost on Isabella that she was serving at an event designed to support arts education while being denied the very opportunities the foundation claimed to promote. The disconnect between the evening's stated purpose and the treatment of the people making it possible exemplified the kind of performative philanthropy that allowed wealthy people to feel virtuous while maintaining systems that limited opportunities for people like herself. As the formal program concluded, and guests moved into the ballroom for dancing and further socializing, Isabella was clearing champagne glasses from abandoned tables when she heard her name called with a tone that made her blood run cold. Isabella. Vincent's voice carried across the room with the authority of someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Come here. Every conversation in the ballroom paused as the assembled guests turned to see what their host intended. Isabella felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment as she realized she had suddenly become the center of attention in a room full of people who normally didn't acknowledge her existence. She walked toward Vincent with as much dignity as she could manage, acutely aware that every step was being observed and judged by people who viewed her as entertainment rather than a human being. Vincent stood beside the mansion's magnificent Steinway grand piano, an instrument worth more than Isabella would earn in several lifetimes of domestic work. The piano itself was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and engineering, built by Steinway's most skilled artisans and finished with a lustrous black polish that reflected the ballroom's chandelier like a mirror. Vincent had purchased it not because he played piano himself, but because it served as a status symbol that demonstrated his wealth and cultural sophistication to visitors and guests. "Ladies and gentlemen," Vincent announced to the assembled crowd, his voice carrying the theatrical tone of someone who enjoyed being the center of attention, "I have a special treat for you this evening. Our Isabella here has been working in my household for several months, and I've discovered that she has some rather interesting talents." The way he pronounced the word talents made it clear that he was setting up some form of elaborate joke at Isabella's expense. The guests smiled with anticipation, ready to be entertained by whatever humiliation their host had devised. Isabella felt her heart racing as she realized what was happening. Somehow Vincent had discovered her secret. The fact that she spent her rare free time playing the old piano in the mansion's music room, the one place where she could temporarily escape the constraints of her position and connect with the part of herself that had dreams beyond domestic service. "It seems," Vincent continued, his voice dripping with condescension, "that our maid fancies herself something of a musician. She's been sneaking into my music room during her breaks, playing my piano as if she were some kind of concert artist." The revelation drew gasps and murmurs from the assembled guests, who had been completely unaware that one of the evening's service staff possessed any interests beyond their professional duties. The idea that a domestic worker might have artistic aspirations struck many of them as presumptuous and slightly ridiculous, an overstepping of social boundaries that needed to be corrected. Dr. Richard Pemberton, a prominent physician and amateur pianist himself, shook his head with the kind of patronizing amusement that came from witnessing someone step outside their designated role. "How charming," he said loudly enough for nearby guests to hear. "I suppose everyone needs hobbies, even if they're rather above their station." Mrs. Charlotte Whitman, whose own daughter had received expensive piano lessons from prestigious instructors, tittered with barely concealed disdain. "I do hope she hasn't damaged anything. These instruments are so delicate, and they require proper understanding to maintain." The crowd chuckled, with the kind of condescending amusement that came from watching someone step outside their designated social role. To them, the idea of a domestic worker having artistic aspirations was inherently ridiculous, a presumption that needed to be corrected through public embarrassment. Vincent basked in the attention his announcement had generated, clearly enjoying his role as the orchestrator of the evening's entertainment. He had always found pleasure in asserting his dominance over people who couldn't retaliate, and the public nature of this particular humiliation made it especially satisfying. "Now, I believe in encouraging the help to develop their talents," Vincent said with mock generosity, his tone making it clear that he viewed Isabella's musical interests as an amusing delusion rather than legitimate artistic pursuit. "So I thought it would be appropriate to give Isabella an opportunity to share her musical gifts with all of us." The suggestion drew appreciative laughter from the crowd, who understood that Vincent was setting Isabella up for failure in the most public possible way. They anticipated being entertained by her obvious limitations, by the gap between her presumptions and her actual abilities, by the spectacle of someone being reminded of their proper place in society. Senator James Morrison, who had built his political career on appeals to traditional social hierarchies, nodded approvingly at Vincent's approach. "Quite right," he said. "It's important for people to understand their capabilities and limitations. Realistic expectations are essential for a stable society." The comments from the guests created a chorus of agreement that revealed their shared assumption about what was about to unfold. They expected Isabella to embarrass herself, to demonstrate through her inadequate performance that her aspirations were unrealistic and inappropriate. They saw Vincent's forced invitation as a kindness that would help her accept her limitations and abandon unrealistic dreams. Isabella's hands trembled as she realized the full scope of Vincent's intended humiliation. He was going to force her to perform in front of this crowd of wealthy, sophisticated people who would judge her harshly, regardless of how well she played. If she performed poorly, they would laugh at her presumption. If she played well, they would be offended by the suggestion that someone of her social status could possess genuine artistic ability. The trap was perfectly constructed. Any performance she gave would be interpreted through the lens of their preconceptions about social class and appropriate aspirations. Excellence would be dismissed as luck or imitation, while inadequacy would be seen as proof of inherent limitations. "I don't think that's necessary, Mr. Harrington," Isabella said quietly, hoping to deflect the situation without creating a scene that would make her position in the household untenable. Her voice carried a dignity that surprised some of the guests, who had expected subservience or pleading. Instead, Isabella spoke with the quiet confidence of someone who understood exactly what was happening and refused to be diminished by it. "Nonsense," Vincent replied with the tone of someone who wasn't accustomed to having his entertainment plans thwarted. "I insist. After all, if you're confident enough to use my piano without permission, surely you're confident enough to demonstrate your abilities in front of my guests." The challenge was delivered with enough edge that Isabella understood she had no real choice in the matter. Refusing would be insubordination that could cost her not just this job, but her reputation in the tight-knit network of wealthy households that employed domestic workers. She would be labeled as difficult and ungrateful, making it nearly impossible to find similar employment elsewhere. Moreover, Vincent had structured the situation so that any refusal would appear to confirm that her musical interests were indeed pretentious overreaching. If she declined to perform, the guests would conclude that she had been exposed as a fraud who couldn't back up her artistic pretensions when challenged. Isabella looked around the room at the faces surrounding her, some openly amused, others expectant, a few showing traces of what might have been sympathy but no willingness to intervene on her behalf. She was completely alone in a hostile environment, facing a test that had been designed to ensure her failure and humiliation. "Very well," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the humiliation she felt. "What would you like me to play?" The question drew another wave of appreciative laughter from the crowd, who interpreted her compliance as evidence that she was too naive to understand the trap that had been set for her. They expected her to request something simple and safe, perhaps a basic popular song or elementary classical piece that would expose her limitations while allowing her to avoid complete disaster. Vincent's smile was predatory. "Oh, I think you should choose something that demonstrates your range. Perhaps something classical. After all, if you're going to play my Steinway, you should attempt something worthy of the instrument." The suggestion drew appreciative laughter from the crowd, who understood that Vincent was setting Isabella up for failure in the most sophisticated way possible. Classical piano repertoire required years of formal training and practice that someone in Isabella's position couldn't possibly have received. The expectation was that she would struggle through a simplified piece, providing entertainment through her obvious limitations while reinforcing everyone's assumptions about social class and artistic ability. Dr. Pemberton nodded approvingly at Vincent's strategy. "Quite right. Classical music is the true test of musical education and refinement. It requires not just technical skill but cultural understanding that comes only through proper training and exposure." Mrs. Adelaide Foster, whose family had patronized classical musicians for generations, smiled with anticipation. "I'm curious to see what she considers classical music." "I suspect her definition might be rather different from ours." The comments revealed the audience's assumption that Isabella would either avoid classical music entirely or attempt something so simplified that it would embarrass both her and the tradition she was presuming to represent. They saw her situation as a teaching moment about the importance of knowing one's place and accepting appropriate limitations. Isabella approached the piano bench with as much composure as she could manage, acutely aware that every eye in the room was focused on her with the kind of anticipation usually reserved for watching automobile accidents or other spectacles of human misfortune. She sat down and placed her hands on the keyboard, feeling the familiar comfort of the instrument despite the hostile circumstances. The Steinway beneath her fingers was indeed a magnificent instrument, with a touch and tone that far exceeded anything Isabella had ever played. She could feel the potential for expression that the piano offered, the way its perfectly regulated action and resonant voice could translate the subtlest musical intentions into sound that could move hearts and minds. For a moment, Isabella closed her eyes and tried to block out the crowd of watching faces. She thought about her grandmother, who had recognized Isabella's musical gift when she was just 5 years old and had sacrificed enormously to provide piano lessons despite the family's limited resources. She thought about the countless hours she had spent practicing on an old upright piano in their cramped apartment, dreaming of someday playing on an instrument like the magnificent Steinway beneath her fingers. Elena Martinez had been more than just Isabella's grandmother. She had been her first and most important teacher, the person who had introduced her to the transformative power of music and the discipline required to develop artistic gifts. Elena had studied piano in her youth in Mexico, before immigration and economic necessity had forced her to abandon her musical ambitions and work in factories to support her family. But Elena had never lost her love for music, or her understanding of its power to transcend circumstances and connect people across barriers of language, culture, and social class. She had seen in young Isabella not just natural talent, but the emotional sensitivity and intellectual curiosity that were essential for serious musical development. Under Elena's patient guidance, Isabella had progressed far beyond what anyone would have expected given the family's limited resources. Elena had used her knowledge of classical repertoire to introduce Isabella to increasingly challenging pieces, teaching her not just to play the notes correctly, but to understand the musical structures and emotional content that made classical music a living art form rather than mere technical exercise. When the family's financial situation had forced Isabella to abandon her formal education and enter domestic work, Elena had made her promise to continue developing her musical abilities whenever possible. "Music is not a luxury," Elena had told her granddaughter. "It is food for the soul, and the soul that is not fed will starve no matter how much money surrounds it." Most importantly, she thought about the music itself, the way it had sustained her through years of economic struggle and social humiliation, providing a refuge where beauty and meaning existed independently of wealth or social status. Whatever happened in the next few minutes, the music belonged to her in a way that Vincent's money could never touch. Isabella opened her eyes and began to play. She had chosen Chopin's Ballet No. 1 in G minor, a piece that required not just technical proficiency, but emotional depth and interpretive sophistication. It was a risky choice that could either vindicate her artistic abilities or expose them as inadequate to the demands of serious classical music. The ballade was one of Chopin's most challenging and emotionally complex compositions, a piece that demanded not just virtuosic technique, but profound musical understanding. It was the kind of repertoire that professional pianists approached with respect and preparation, aware that its technical demands were matched by interpretive challenges that could expose any weakness in musical training or artistic sensitivity. Isabella had first encountered the piece years earlier, when Elena had played a recording of it performed by the great pianist Arthur Rubinstein. The music had moved Isabella to tears with its combination of lyrical beauty and dramatic intensity, its ability to express the full range of human emotion within a single cohesive narrative structure. Learning the ballad had become Isabella's most ambitious musical project during her teenage years, a challenge that had required her to develop new levels of technical control and artistic understanding. Elena had guided her through the process with the same patient dedication she had brought to all of Isabella's musical education, helping her understand not just how to play the notes, but how to reveal the emotional and structural logic that made the piece a masterwork of romantic expression. The opening notes filled the ballroom with a richness and complexity that immediately captured the attention of everyone present. Isabella's fingers moved across the keyboard with a combination of precision and expressiveness that suggested years of serious study and practice. The melody unfolded with the kind of musical intelligence that could only come from deep understanding of the composer's intentions and the emotional landscape of the piece. The sound that emerged from the Steinway was unlike anything the guests had expected to hear from Isabella. Instead of the hesitant amateur performance they had anticipated, they were hearing playing of a caliber that would have been impressive in a professional concert hall. The tone was rich and controlled, the phrasing intelligent and musically convincing, the technical execution clean and confident. As the music developed, the atmosphere in the room began to change. The anticipatory smiles faded from the guests' faces, replaced by expressions of confusion and growing amazement. This wasn't the stumbling amateur performance they had expected. This was playing of a caliber that would have been impressive in a professional concert hall. Dr. Pemberton's confident smile faltered as he realized that Isabella's musical abilities far exceeded his own, despite his years of expensive lessons and access to the finest instruments. Mrs. Whitman's expression of condescending amusement transformed into something approaching shock as she recognized that Isabella's interpretation of the Chopin revealed musical understanding that couldn't be faked or imitated. Senator Morrison found himself leaning forward in attention, drawn into the musical narrative despite his preconceptions about the performer. Mrs. Foster's assumptions about cultural education and artistic refinement were being challenged by the evidence of her own ears, which told her that she was hearing musicianship of the highest caliber. Isabella lost herself in the music, her technical control allowing her to focus entirely on the emotional content of the piece. The ballad's dramatic contrasts, tender lyrical passages, alternating with sections of passionate intensity, seemed to pour directly from her heart through her fingers to the piano keys. Every phrase was shaped with the kind of musical sensitivity that couldn't be taught, only developed through years of patient study and genuine love for the art form. The music told a story that transcended language and social barriers, speaking directly to the universal human experiences of hope, struggle, loss, and triumph. Isabella's interpretation revealed new depths in the familiar composition, finding connections between musical passages that illuminated the piece's overall emotional architecture. As the ballad progressed through its various sections, Isabella demonstrated not just technical proficiency, but the kind of artistic maturity that typically developed only through years of serious performance experience. Her tempo choices were convincing and musically logical. Her dynamic contrasts created narrative tension without sacrificing musical flow, and her pedaling created harmonic colors that enhanced rather than obscured Chopin's intricate voice leading. Vincent's confident smile began to falter as he realized that his attempt at humiliation was backfiring spectacularly. Instead of providing entertainment through failure, Isabella was delivering a performance that was making him and his guests look foolish for having underestimated her abilities. The social dynamics he had intended to reinforce were being inverted in the most public possible way. The guests themselves were experiencing a kind of cognitive dissonance as they tried to reconcile Isabella's obvious musical sophistication with their assumptions about domestic workers and social class. Some of them were musicians themselves, or at least knowledgeable about classical music, and they could recognize that what they were hearing represented years of serious training and exceptional natural talent. Mrs. Eleanor Cambridge, whose late husband had been a prominent music critic, found herself transported by Isabella's interpretation. She had heard the Chopin ballade performed by many of the world's leading pianists, but Isabella's performance revealed aspects of the piece that she had never noticed before. Musical connections and emotional depths that spoke to both technical mastery and profound artistic sensitivity. James Fletcher, a successful businessman who collected rare manuscripts and supported young musicians through his private foundation, was taking mental notes about Isabella's abilities. He recognized that he was witnessing the kind of raw talent that appeared perhaps once in a generation, musical gifts that deserved professional development and public recognition. Dr. Sarah Wellington, a professor of music history at the prestigious Whitmore Conservatory, was analyzing Isabella's performance with the trained ear of someone who had spent decades evaluating musical potential. What she heard convinced her that Isabella possessed not just exceptional technical ability, but the kind of artistic intelligence that couldn't be developed without serious musical training and genuine emotional depth. As the ballad reached its climactic passages, Isabella's playing took on an almost transcendent quality. Her technique was flawless, but more importantly, her interpretation revealed depths of emotional understanding that transformed the familiar piece into something fresh and revelatory. She wasn't just playing the notes. She was communicating directly with the audience through the universal language of music. The middle section of the ballade, with its contrasting lyrical melody in A-flat major, emerged under Isabella's fingers with a tenderness and vulnerability that brought tears to several listeners' eyes. She shaped each phrase with the kind of musical sensitivity that suggested not just technical training, but lived experience with the emotions Chopin had embedded in his composition. When the piece returned to its opening material, now transformed by the journey through contrasting moods and keys, Isabella's interpretation revealed the psychological sophistication of Chopin's compositional approach. She demonstrated how the composer had used musical repetition not as mere recapitulation, but as a way of showing how experiences change us, how we hear familiar themes differently after we have traveled through various emotional landscapes. The final section of the ballade built to its dramatic conclusion with increasing intensity, Isabella's hands flying across the keyboard with power and precision that demonstrated complete mastery of both the technical and expressive demands of the piece. Her interpretation of the final climactic passages was both thrilling and deeply moving, combining virtuosic display with musical meaning in a way that left no doubt about her artistic legitimacy. When the last notes faded into silence, the ballroom remained absolutely quiet for several long seconds, as if the audience was reluctant to break the spell that Isabella's performance had cast. The silence was different from the expectant quiet that had preceded her performance. This was the reverential stillness that followed genuinely transcendent artistic experiences. Then, slowly, one person began to applaud. It was Dr. Wellington, whose professional expertise made her recognition especially meaningful. Her applause was joined by that of James Fletcher, then by Mrs. Cambridge, and gradually by every person in the room. Within moments, the entire room was applauding with genuine enthusiasm, their clapping reflecting not condescending approval, but real appreciation for the extraordinary musical experience they had just witnessed. The applause continued for several minutes, with some guests calling out expressions of appreciation and amazement. "Brava!" shouted someone from the back of the room. "Extraordinary!" called another voice. The response was unlike anything typically heard at social gatherings, more resembling the kind of ovation usually reserved for professional concerts than polite appreciation for amateur entertainment. Isabella rose from the piano bench and faced the audience, her cheeks flushed from the intensity of her performance and the surreal nature of the situation. She had expected ridicule or polite dismissal, not the kind of sustained applause usually reserved for professional artists. The transformation in the room's atmosphere was so complete that she felt momentarily disoriented. Vincent himself stood frozen beside the piano, his face cycling through a series of expressions as he tried to process what had just happened. His attempt to humiliate Isabella had instead elevated her to a level of respect and admiration that he had never achieved despite his wealth and social position. The guests were looking at her with genuine interest and appreciation, while their glances toward him carried undertones of disapproval for his obvious attempt at cruelty. Dr. Margaret Ashford, a prominent philanthropist and patron of the arts, stepped forward from the crowd. Isabella recognized her as someone whose name appeared regularly in the society pages, in connection with cultural events and charitable causes. "That was extraordinary," Dr. Ashford said, her voice carrying the authority of someone whose opinions on musical matters were widely respected. "Where did you receive your training?" Isabella felt overwhelmed by the question and the genuine interest behind it. "I studied with my grandmother when I was young, and I've continued practicing on my own whenever possible." "Your grandmother must have been a remarkable teacher," Dr. Ashford replied. "That level of musical sophistication doesn't develop without exceptional guidance and enormous dedication." Other guests began approaching Isabella, offering compliments and asking questions about her musical background. The conversation that developed around her was unlike anything she had experienced in her years of domestic work. People were speaking to her as an equal, treating her opinions and experiences as worthy of attention and respect. Meanwhile, Vincent retreated to the edge of the gathering, his face darkening as he watched his carefully orchestrated humiliation transform into a celebration of Isabella's talent. Several guests were already discussing opportunities they might be able to offer her: private lessons for their children, performances at smaller gatherings, connections to music teachers and performance venues. Eleanor Harrington approached her husband with an expression that mixed embarrassment with barely concealed anger. "That was cruel, Vincent," she said quietly. "You intended to humiliate that young woman in front of our guests." "I had no idea she could actually play," Vincent replied defensively. "I thought she was just pretending, wasting time on something she had no business attempting." "You thought wrong," Eleanor said coldly. "And now everyone in this room knows exactly what kind of man you are." The confrontation between Vincent and Eleanor was interrupted by Dr. Ashford, who approached them with Isabella at her side. "Mr. Harrington," Dr. Ashford said with formal politeness, "I'd like to discuss something with you regarding Isabella's musical education." Vincent forced a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Of course, Margaret. What did you have in mind?" "I'm involved with the Metropolitan Conservatory's scholarship program for exceptionally talented students who lack the financial resources for formal training. Based on what I heard tonight, Isabella would be an ideal candidate for full scholarship support, including living expenses during her studies." The offer hung in the air like a challenge. Dr. Ashford was presenting an opportunity that could transform Isabella's life, but accepting it would require Vincent's permission, since Isabella was his employee. Everyone present understood the test of character that was being presented. "That's very generous," Vincent said carefully, "but Isabella has obligations to my household. I can't simply release her from her employment commitments." The response drew subtle but unmistakable disapproval from the surrounding guests. Dr. Ashford's expression remained diplomatically neutral, but her tone carried an edge that suggested she was accustomed to dealing with obstinate, wealthy men. "Of course," Dr. Ashford replied, "but surely you wouldn't want to prevent a young woman of exceptional talent from pursuing an opportunity that could change her life. After all, your reputation as a patron of the arts suggests you understand the importance of supporting artistic development." The challenge was delivered with the kind of social pressure that Vincent couldn't ignore without damaging his carefully cultivated image. Several other guests had moved close enough to overhear the conversation, and their expectant faces made it clear that his response would be remembered and discussed in social circles throughout the city. Isabella herself remained silent during the exchange, understanding that speaking might jeopardize the delicate negotiations taking place on her behalf. But her heart was racing as she contemplated the possibility that her life might be about to change in ways she had never dared to imagine. "Well," Vincent said finally, "I suppose we could discuss some kind of arrangement. Perhaps a gradual transition that allows Isabella to pursue her studies while maintaining some of her current responsibilities." Dr. Ashford smiled with the satisfaction of someone who had achieved exactly what she intended. "That sounds very reasonable. Why don't we plan to meet next week to work out the details?" As the conversation continued, Isabella found herself surrounded by people offering encouragement, advice, and connections that could help her navigate the transition from domestic worker to serious music student. The transformation was so sudden and complete that she felt like she was experiencing someone else's life. James Morrison, a businessman who served on the conservatory's board of directors, handed Isabella his business card. "I'd like you to audition for our summer program," he said. "Based on tonight's performance, I'm confident you'd be accepted immediately." Maria Santos, a professional pianist who performed with the City Symphony, offered to provide Isabella with preparatory coaching for her conservatory auditions. "Your technique is already quite advanced," she said, "but there are aspects of conservatory training that require specific preparation." Even some of Vincent's business associates began approaching Isabella with opportunities. Robert Chen, who owned several high-end restaurants, suggested that she might enjoy performing at private dinner parties while she completed her studies. "The pay would be excellent," he explained, "and it would give you performance experience in front of appreciative audiences." As the evening wound down and guests began departing, many of them made a point of speaking personally with Isabella before leaving. The comments she received ranged from simple appreciation for her performance to specific offers of assistance with her musical education and career development. Dr. Ashford was among the last to leave, and she pulled Isabella aside for a private conversation. "What happened here tonight was remarkable," she said. "Not just your performance, but the way you handled a situation that was designed to diminish you. That shows character that's even rarer than musical talent." "Thank you," Isabella replied. "I still can't quite believe this is really happening." "Believe it," Dr. Ashford said firmly. You have a gift that deserves to be developed and shared. The conservatory scholarship will provide you with world-class training, but the most important qualities you need for success, talent, determination, and integrity, you already possess. After the guests departed, Isabella remained in the ballroom, sitting alone at the piano that had been the catalyst for everything that had just transpired. The room felt different now, transformed from a space where she had expected humiliation into one where she had discovered possibilities she had never imagined. Vincent approached her as she sat quietly at the keyboard, his earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been shame. "Isabella," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Isabella looked up at him with surprise. In the 6 months she had worked for him, she had never heard Vincent apologize to anyone, much less to a member of his household staff. "I intended to embarrass you tonight," he continued. "I thought you were presumptuous for using my piano, and I wanted to put you in your place. I was wrong, and I'm sorry." Isabella considered his words carefully before responding. "Mr. Harrington, I appreciate your apology, but what you attempted to do tonight wasn't just about me. It was about the assumption that people like me don't deserve respect or opportunities because of our economic circumstances." Vincent's face showed that her words had hit their target. "You're right," he said. "I've spent so much time thinking about money and social position that I forgot about basic human dignity. The conservatory opportunity that Dr. Ashford offered, will you really support it?" "Yes," Vincent replied without hesitation. "In fact, I'd like to do more than just release you from your employment obligations. I'd like to contribute to your scholarship fund and help ensure that you have everything you need to succeed." Isabella felt tears of gratitude and relief fill her eyes. "Why? Why would you do that after what happened tonight?" Vincent was quiet for a moment before answering. "Because your performance reminded me of something I had forgotten. Real excellence isn't about money or social status. It's about dedication, talent, and the courage to pursue something meaningful despite obstacles. You have all of those qualities, and I'd like to help you develop them." The conversation was interrupted by Eleanor, who had been watching from the doorway. "Isabella," she said gently, "you should know that several of our guests tonight have already called to express their interest in supporting your musical education. What you accomplished here has created opportunities that extend far beyond what any of us initially imagined." Over the following days, Isabella's life transformed with almost dreamlike rapidity. Dr. Ashford arranged for her to audition at the Metropolitan Conservatory, where her performance earned not just admission, but the most prestigious scholarship the institution offered. The scholarship covered not only tuition, but living expenses, allowing Isabella to focus entirely on her musical development. Vincent proved true to his word, establishing a fund that would support Isabella's education through graduate studies if she chose to pursue them. His contribution was significant enough to cover any expenses not addressed by the conservatory scholarship, ensuring that financial concerns wouldn't limit her artistic development. But perhaps more importantly, the network of connections Isabella had made at the charity gala opened doors she hadn't known existed. Maria Santos began providing weekly coaching sessions that prepared Isabella for the demanding curriculum she would face at the conservatory. James Morrison arranged for her to perform at several high-profile cultural events, giving her experience with different types of audiences and repertoire. Robert Chen's offer to perform at private dinner parties provided Isabella with income that allowed her to help support her family while pursuing her studies. The work was enjoyable and well compensated, involving performances for small groups of music lovers who appreciated her artistry. Within 3 months of that transformative evening at the Harrington Mansion, Isabella had moved into student housing at the conservatory and begun intensive studies with some of the most respected piano teachers in the country. Her professors were impressed not just by her technical abilities, but by her musical maturity and interpretive sophistication. Dr. Elena Volkov, Isabella's primary instructor, had performed with major orchestras throughout Europe and was known for accepting only the most promising students. After Isabella's first lesson, she made a comment that would guide Isabella's development throughout her conservatory years. "You have something that cannot be taught," Dr. Volkov said. "You understand that music is not about displaying technical skill. It is about communication, about touching something universal in the human experience. Technical perfection can be developed through practice, But musical soul is a gift that must be treasured and nurtured. Isabella's progress at the conservatory exceeded even the optimistic expectations of her supporters. She mastered challenging repertoire with remarkable speed, performed in student recitals that drew attendance from professional musicians and critics, and developed a reputation as one of the most promising young artists in the program. But her success wasn't limited to academic achievement. Isabella became involved in community outreach programs that brought classical music to underserved populations, working with children who reminded her of herself, talented young people whose potential might be overlooked because of their economic circumstances. During her second year at the conservatory, Isabella established a mentorship program that connected music students with young people from low-income families who showed musical aptitude. The program provided free lessons, instrument loans, and performance opportunities that could serve as stepping stones to more formal musical education. "Music saved my life," Isabella explained during a fundraising presentation for the program. "Not just by providing me with career opportunities, but by giving me a sense of dignity and purpose that sustained me through difficult times. Every child deserves access to that kind of transformative experience." The mentorship program grew rapidly, attracting support from professional musicians, music educators, and philanthropists who understood the importance of making artistic education accessible regardless of economic background. Isabella's personal story, her journey from domestic worker to conservatory student, became a powerful symbol of the potential that existed in overlooked communities. Vincent Harrington became one of the program's most generous supporters, contributing not just financially, but by opening his social network to Isabella's fundraising efforts. His transformation from antagonist to advocate was so complete that many people who hadn't witnessed the original charity gala incident found it difficult to believe he had ever treated Isabella with anything but respect and support. During Isabella's third year at the conservatory, she was invited to perform as soloist with the Metropolitan Symphony Orchestra, performing Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No. 2 in a subscription concert that would be attended by the city's most sophisticated classical music audiences. The invitation represented the kind of opportunity that typically came only to established professional artists. For a conservatory student to be offered such a prominent platform was almost unprecedented, reflecting the exceptional regard in which Isabella's artistry was held by the musical community. The concert took place on a Saturday evening in May, in the Symphony Hall where Isabella had once sat in the cheapest seats, dreaming of someday performing on the stage that had seemed impossibly distant from her reality as a domestic worker. Now she sat in the artist's green room, preparing for a performance that would be reviewed by major newspapers and heard by an audience that included many of the people who had witnessed her original performance at the Harrington Mansion. Dr. Ashford arrived backstage before the performance to offer encouragement and perspective. "Isabella," she said, "I want you to remember something tonight. What you're about to do isn't just about your own artistic achievement. You're representing everyone who has ever been told their dreams were unrealistic because of their circumstances. Play for them as well as for yourself." Vincent and Eleanor Harrington were in the audience that evening, sitting in the same box they had occupied for symphony performances throughout their marriage. But this concert felt different from any they had attended before. Instead of being passive consumers of culture, they were witnessing the artistic development of someone whose journey they had directly influenced. "I keep thinking about that night at our house," Eleanor said to Vincent, as they waited for the performance to begin. "If you hadn't forced Isabella to play, none of this would have happened." Vincent nodded slowly. "Sometimes the most important moments in our lives come disguised as our worst impulses. I intended to humiliate her, but instead I created an opportunity for her to reveal her gifts. I'll be grateful for that accident of timing for the rest of my life." When Isabella walked onto the stage and took her place at the concert grand piano, the audience greeted her with warmth that reflected their awareness of her unique story. She had become something of a local celebrity, not just for her musical abilities, but for what her success represented about the potential that existed in unexpected places. The Rachmaninoff Concerto was a perfect choice for Isabella's symphony debut. The piece demanded not just technical virtuosity, but emotional depth and orchestral sensitivity, qualities that Isabella had developed through her years of serious study and performance experience. More importantly, the concerto's themes of struggle, triumph, and ultimate transcendence resonated with Isabella's own life experience. As the orchestra began the concerto's opening theme, and Isabella prepared for her entrance, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a scared domestic worker sitting at a piano bench in front of hostile strangers to a confident artist about to perform with one of the country's finest orchestras, the transformation seemed almost magical, but Isabella knew it had been built through years of disciplined work and the support of people who had chosen to believe in her potential. Her performance that evening was everything her supporters had hoped for and more. Isabella played with technical mastery that impressed even the most demanding critics, but her interpretation went beyond mere proficiency to achieve the kind of emotional communication that marked the difference between competent execution and genuine artistry. The audience's response was overwhelming. They applauded not just at the conclusion of the concerto, but after each movement, expressing appreciation that went beyond conventional concert etiquette. When Isabella returned to the stage for her final bow, the standing ovation lasted nearly 10 minutes, with many audience members calling out expressions of admiration and gratitude. The reviews that appeared in the following day's newspapers confirmed what everyone in the concert hall had experienced. Isabella's performance was described as transcendent, emotionally devastating, and a reminder of why classical music continues to matter in the modern world. But the review that meant the most to Isabella appeared in the conservatory's student newsletter, written by one of her fellow students. "Isabella Martinez doesn't just play music," the review said. "She uses music to tell the story of every person who has ever been underestimated, overlooked, or denied opportunities because of circumstances beyond their control." Her performance reminded all of us why we became musicians in the first place: to touch something universal in the human experience and share it with others. Following her symphony debut, Isabella received offers from management companies, recording labels, and prestigious music festivals throughout the world. The little girl who had learned piano on an old upright in a cramped apartment had become a sought-after artist whose performances were eagerly anticipated by classical music lovers everywhere. But success hadn't changed Isabella's fundamental values or her commitment to using her platform to help others. She continued working with her mentorship program, now expanded to serve hundreds of young musicians from disadvantaged backgrounds. She performed benefit concerts that raised money for music education in public schools, and she spoke regularly at events focused on expanding access to arts education. During one such speaking engagement, Isabella was asked about the moment that had changed her life, the evening when Vincent Harrington had forced her to play piano at his charity gala. "People often ask me whether I'm grateful to Mr. Harrington for creating that opportunity," Isabella said. "The answer is complicated. I'm grateful that the evening led to the opportunities I've received, but I'll never be grateful for his intention to humiliate me. What I've learned is that we can't control other people's actions, but we can control how we respond to them. When someone tries to diminish you, you can choose to let that define you, or you can choose to prove them wrong. The most important lesson from that experience," she continued, "is that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect, regardless of their economic circumstances or social position. Talent and worth aren't determined by wealth or status. They exist in every community, at every economic level, among people whose potential might never be recognized if we judge them by external appearances rather than by their character and abilities." 5 years after her conservatory graduation, Isabella had established herself as one of the most respected pianists of her generation. She performed regularly with major orchestras, had recorded several critically acclaimed albums, and was sought after as a teacher by young musicians from around the world. But perhaps her most meaningful achievement was the Isabella Martinez Foundation, an organization dedicated to providing musical education and performance opportunities to talented young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. The foundation operated programs in dozens of cities, supporting hundreds of aspiring musicians who might otherwise never have access to serious musical training. Vincent Harrington remained one of the foundation's most generous supporters, serving on its board of directors and using his business connections to expand its reach and impact. His relationship with Isabella had evolved into something resembling a surrogate father-daughter dynamic, built on mutual respect and shared commitment to expanding musical opportunities. "Isabella taught me that true wealth isn't measured by money or possessions," Vincent said during one foundation fundraising event. "It's measured by the positive impact we have on other people's lives. She transformed my understanding of what it means to be successful and I'll be grateful for that lesson for the rest of my life. The foundation's work attracted national attention and support from major philanthropists, corporations, and government agencies committed to arts education. Isabella found herself testifying before Congress about the importance of music education funding, speaking at international conferences about cultural accessibility, and collaborating with educators to develop innovative approaches to identifying and nurturing musical talent. But through all her professional success and public recognition, Isabella never forgot the lesson she had learned that transformative evening in the Harrington mansion. True dignity came not from external validation, but from commitment to excellence, integrity, and service to others. The little girl who had dreamed of playing piano for appreciative audiences had achieved those dreams, but she had also discovered that the greatest satisfaction came from helping others achieve their own. Standing on stage after performances, acknowledging the applause of audiences who appreciated not just her artistry, but what her success represented, Isabella often thought about other young people who might be facing their own moments of testing. She hoped that her story would encourage them to persist in pursuing their dreams despite obstacles, to find strength in their values when others tried to diminish them, and to remember that genuine excellence always finds a way to reveal itself, regardless of the circumstances in which it develops. The piano that had been the catalyst for Isabella's transformation still sat in the Harrington Mansion's music room, but now it was used regularly by scholarship recipients from Isabella's foundation who came to practice and receive coaching from visiting artists. Vincent had converted the space into a kind of musical salon where young performers could develop their skills in an environment that celebrated their potential rather than judging their backgrounds. Isabella visited the mansion several times each year, both to work with foundation students and to maintain her friendship with Vincent and Eleanor. The room where she had once been humiliated had become a place of nurturing and encouragement, proof that spaces could be transformed by the intentions and actions of the people who occupied them. During one such visit, Isabella sat at the Steinway and played the same Chopin ballade that had changed her life 7 years earlier. But this time, instead of a hostile audience seeking entertainment from her failure, she played for a small group of young musicians who looked at her with admiration and hope, seeing in her success proof that their own dreams might be achievable. As the final notes of the ballade faded into the afternoon silence, Isabella smiled at the young faces watching her with such attention and respect. She thought about the journey that had brought her from that terrifying evening, when she had been forced to perform for strangers who expected her to fail, to this moment when she could share her love of music with young people who saw her as a mentor and inspiration. The greatest gift of her success, Isabella realized, wasn't the professional recognition or financial security she had achieved. It was the opportunity to ensure that other talented young people wouldn't have to wait for accidental opportunities to reveal their gifts. Through the foundation's work, through her teaching and mentoring, through her performances that carried messages of hope and possibility, Isabella was creating a world where talent could flourish, regardless of the circumstances in which it was discovered. The music would continue, passed from one generation to the next, creating bridges across social divides and opening doors that had once seemed permanently closed. And somewhere, Isabella knew, her grandmother Elena was smiling, proud that the gifts she had nurtured had grown into something that could transform not just one life, but countless others who needed proof that dreams could survive any challenge when supported by determination, dignity, and the eternal transformative power of music that transcends all boundaries of class, circumstance, and social expectation throughout time and across all cultures worldwide, forever and always in perpetual harmony evermore.